Amidst the heavy rain, an old war horse stands motionless in the corral, its eyes distant, as if remembering the battles of the past. But something is strange. There's no recognition in its gaze, only an empty void. As the man approaches, he realizes that the bond they once shared is now gone, replaced by an unsettling stranger stare. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. He wasn't just a horse, he was a shadow of something greater, a forgotten legend. But now with a coat marked by scars and a seemingly broken spirit, all that was left of him was silence. No one dared to get too close. In the distance, the growl of an engine broke through the somber air. An old battered pickup truck, covered in dust, slowly made its way up the driveway. Inside, John Anderson, a 37-year-old man, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, but his mind was trapped in the past. He hadn't set foot on that Wyoming ranch in years, not since he had lost everything. The army, his unit, and what was left of his own identity. But now he was back, and it was all because of that horse. As John stepped out of the truck, the rain began to fall in thick, heavy drops, staining the hat he wore to hide his slightly graying hair. He approached the corral slowly, as if each step carried an invisible weight. There stood Augustus, his former partner, the horse who had saved his life more times than he could count. But something in Augustus's gaze hit John like a dagger to the chest. It was empty, hollow, as if that animal was no longer the same. "Augustus," John murmured, barely audible, as his eyes burned with emotion. He gripped the fence tightly and extended his hand, hoping for a sign, anything. But Augustus didn't move. Worse, he took a few steps back, letting out a soft whinny, as if the man in front of him was just a stranger. John felt a lump in his throat. He knew this reunion would be hard, but he wasn't prepared for this. In the distance, Kimmy, a young Wyoming ranch hand, watched everything unfold. She approached hesitantly. "He doesn't trust anyone," she said softly, looking at John, "especially men. Something happened to him." John turned to her, but didn't respond. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew why Augustus was there, lost like a ghost, and that reason was something he carried as an invisible scar. The rain picked up, falling harder as John stood there, breathing heavily. He turned back to Augustus and murmured, more to himself than to the horse, "I can't fail you, not again." The rain fell like a heavy blanket over the Wyoming ranch, turning the ground into mud and the fences into dark lines against the stormy sky. John stood there motionless, staring at Augustus with a mix of pain and determination. He wanted to believe the horse still recognized him, but the animal's distant, wary gaze said otherwise. A part of him wondered if it was already too late for both of them. Deep down, maybe this was a battle lost before it even began. John felt a tightness in his chest as old memories resurfaced, pulling him back to a night much like this one, but in a completely different place. The suffocating heat of the Arizona desert, the muffled screams, and the relentless sound of gunfire cut through the air. Augustus was there, his eyes wild and his body drenched in sweat, but standing firm by John's side. They had survived together, faced dangers that seemed insurmountable. And now that bond felt broken, like an invisible thread the time and suffering had severed. "You're not like this," John whispered, as if Augustus could understand. His voice trembled, heavy with a guilt he had never admitted out loud. "I failed you, and everyone else." He stepped back slightly, running a hand over his wet face, unsure whether it was rain or tears. Kimmy, still watching from a distance, took a step forward but stopped when she saw John's expression. It was the look of someone lost, carrying a burden far heavier than they could bear. Augustus let out a soft whinny, almost a groan. The sound cut through John in a way words never could. He knew the horse was suffering as much as he was, both trapped in a cycle of trauma that felt impossible to break. Perhaps that's why they had been drawn back to each other, two survivors trying to make sense of the wreckage. The storm grew more intense. the wind howling around them like a reminder of the chaos surrounding them. But John refused to back down. "I'll make you remember," he said, this time more firmly, staring at Augustus with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Even if the horse didn't recognize him now, John knew deep down their connection was still there. He just had to find it before it was too late. The next morning brought a clear, cold sky, but the atmosphere at the Wyoming ranch remained heavy. John had spent the night in one of the small cabins meant for temporary workers, but sleep never came. He lay on the hard bed, staring at the wooden ceiling as flashes of the past overwhelmed his mind. The soldiers' screams, the thunder of explosions, and the sight of Augustus running beside him through enemy fire. It all felt so distant, yet so vividly alive. At dawn, he headed to the pen. Augustus was in the same spot, standing still like a statue, staring into the distance. The horse hadn't approached the fence, not even when Kimmy brought fresh food and water. It was as if he were trapped in a constant state of alertness, unable to relax. John noticed it immediately. He recognized that look because he had felt it too. "I know what you're feeling," John murmured, leaning against the fence. His voice was low but heavy with emotion. "That feeling that you're still there, that you'll never leave, even though the place is long gone." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "I didn't leave it behind, Augustus, and it looks like you didn't either." Kimmy, who had been watching from a distance while gathering the hay, finally approached. "You seem to know this horse well," she said, her voice soft but curious. John looked at her for a moment before responding. "He saved my life, more than once." There was a weight to his words, something the young woman immediately noticed. But before she could ask more, John averted his gaze. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet at least. John knew he had to try something different. He stepped into the pen, his steps slow and deliberate. Augustus perked up his ears, alert but didn't move. John knelt down, bringing himself to the horse's eye level. "Do you remember," he asked, his voice trembling, "the fields, the endless nights, me?" He pulled something from his pocket, a small worn piece of leather, part of the equipment Augustus had worn during the war. When Augustus saw the object, his eyes briefly lit up, but only for a moment before returning to their usual emptiness. John felt a pang in his chest. Maybe Augustus was trying to forget, just as he had tried unsuccessfully. The midday sun was shining brightly over the fence, but the heat didn't affect John or Augustus. They stood there locked in a silent standoff. John held the piece of leather in his hand, as if it were a key that could unlock buried memories. But Augustus's gaze remained hard, unyielding. It was like staring at an impenetrable wall. Frustrated, John took a few steps back, running his hands through his messy hair. He could feel the weight of disappointment growing. He had thought this small object would be enough to break the barrier between them, but he realized that Augustus's trauma ran deeper than he had imagined, maybe even deeper than his own. "I just need a sign, kid," John murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion and pain. Kimmy watched from afar, pretending to be busy with the Wyoming ranch chores, but she couldn't take her eyes off the interaction. There was something about that silent connection that intrigued her deeply. Finally, she gathered the courage to approach. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" she said, crossing her arms. "He has more scars than any other horse here. Maybe some things are irreparable." John stared at her, his eyes flashing with stubbornness. "He's not beyond repair," he replied, his voice firmer than he intended. "I've seen what he's capable of. I've seen the heart he has. That doesn't just disappear." He took a step towards Augustus again, but this time he didn't try to force anything. He simply stood there silently, allowing the horse to sense his presence. And then something happened. It wasn't grand nor dramatic, but for John, it was enough. Augustus slightly turned his head, as if he were recognizing the man in front of him for the first time. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but John felt his heart race. It was the beginning of something, a small crack in the wall that separated him from his old companion. Augustus's movement, small, almost imperceptible, was like a breath of hope in John's chest. He remained still, not moving, afraid that any sudden action might break that fragile moment. The silence around them felt heavier. interrupted only by the soft sound of wind passing through the nearby trees. For the first time in years, John felt that he was not alone in the invisible weight he carried. Augustus slightly tilted his ears toward John, but his body was still tense. He didn't move forward, didn't retreat, but that small gesture was more than John had expected after days of trying to reconnect. "You're still there, aren't you, boy?" John asked quietly, as if speaking to an old friend. His voice had a tone of vulnerability that he rarely allowed to show. Kimmy, watching the scene, slowly approached, holding a bucket of water. She stopped a few steps away, trying not to interrupt the moment. "I've never seen him react like this," she said softly. Maybe you really mean something to him." The doubt in her voice was clear, but there was also a hint of curiosity. Kimmy didn't fully understand the bond John had with that horse, but she was starting to realize it was something far beyond the ordinary. John began to realize that it was something far beyond the ordinary. He sighed, still looking at Augustus. "He saved me when no one else could," he said, his voice heavy with a pain Kimmy hadn't expected to hear. "We were in a valley, surrounded. I thought it was the end. But he didn't hesitate. He faced the fire, the smoke, and pulled me out of there." He paused, looking at the ground before continuing. "And I promised him I'd never leave him behind. But that's exactly what I did." The confession hung in the air, as heavy as lead. Augustus moved his head again, as if he had heard something familiar in John's voice. The horse took a single step forward, its hoof sinking into the soft earth. John couldn't help the shy smile that formed on his face, a smile full of hope mixed with regret. He knew that small step was just the beginning, but it was a beginning. The sound of hooves striking the ground brought a brief sense of relief to John's heart. Augustus had taken another step toward him, but then stopped, as if something invisible was still holding him back. The horse lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the ground, and the moment of connection almost slipped away. John knew forcing him would be pointless. Instead, he knelt right there in the mud, trying to lower himself to the animal's level, just like he had during training. "You don't have to be scared, boy." "Not anymore," he said, his voice soft, heavy with emotion. The silence was broken by a sound in the distance, the roar of a helicopter crossing the sky. Augustus froze. His ears shot forward, and the wild gleam that had disappeared from his eyes returned for a moment. John felt the change in the air, as if he had been transported back to the battlefield. He knew what was happening. Augustus was reliving. The sound of the helicopter was a trigger, a memory so vivid it felt real. John stayed steady, watching as Augustus trembled, muscles tensed, while he neighed louder than he ever had before. The horse began to circle within the pen, his tail whipping from side to side, as if ready to run or fight. Kimmy ran to the fence, her eyes wide. "He's losing it." "John, do something," she shouted, but John raised his hand, signaling for her not to interfere. "Augustus, listen to me," John exclaimed, his voice strong but full of urgency. He walked toward the center of the pen, his hands open in a gesture of calm. Each step felt like a risk, but he didn't hesitate. "You're safe now, sober boy, sober." His tone was firm, but not aggressive. And for a moment, Augustus stopped. The horse was panting, its chest rising and falling quickly, as if the weight of its memories was pressing it to the limit. Then something changed. Augustus lifted his head and looked at John, his eyes filled with what seemed like a mixture of confusion and recognition. He took another step, then another until he finally stopped in front of John. The man reached out, his fingers trembling, and gently touched the horse's forehead. "We're in this together," John whispered. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't just helping Augustus heal. He was also facing his own ghosts. Augustus didn't pull back at John's touch. It was a brief moment, but one filled with meaning, an instant when two survivors, marked by the same invisible scars, finally met. John stood still, his hand resting on the horse's forehead, feeling the warmth and life pulsing beneath the scarred coat. Augustus's breathing, once erratic, began to steady, though the frightened gleam in his eyes hadn't completely faded. "You remember me, don't you?" John murmured, his voice filled with a mix of hope and pain. But he knew that this connection wasn't enough to erase the years of suffering they both carried. Augustus was like a mirror, reflecting back the traumas John had spent his whole life trying to bury. But now, looking at the horse, he knew he couldn't run anymore. Kimmy, watching the scene with a racing heart, took a few hesitant steps toward the fence. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, almost in a whisper. "How do you do it? He barely lets anyone get close." And now her voice faltered as she tried to find the right words to describe what she was witnessing. John didn't answer immediately. He pulled his hand away from Augustus and took a few steps back, giving the horse space to decide what to do. "It's not magic," he said finally, not taking his eyes off Augustus. "It's pain. Pain connects us in ways people don't understand. He knows I carry something, just like he does." Augustus began to walk slowly around the pen, but this time his movements were neither frantic nor filled with panic. He was calm, though still alert. John watched every step, looking for signs that would tell him what to do next. Then he noticed a slight shift in Augustus's gait, a stiffness in the right hind leg. The horse was limping, and John frowned. "He's hurt," John said, turning to Kimmy. "This kind of pain isn't just emotional. He's carrying something in his body too." Kimmy nodded, looking concerned. "I'll call the vet," she said quickly, but John interrupted with a gesture. "No, let me take care of it. If he really recognizes me, then I'm the one he will trust." Kimmy hesitated, but something in John's expression convinced her. She gave a small nod before stepping away, leaving the two of them alone again. John knew he was dealing with much more than physical injuries. Augustus was a complex puzzle, a broken soul who needed time, patience, and above all, redemption. The man took a deep breath, preparing for the next step, fully aware that in order to heal the horse, he would also need to face the parts of himself he had been avoiding for years. John ran his hands along the sides of his head, trying to organize his thoughts as he watched Augustus struggle to walk around the pen. The stiffness in the horse's leg was more noticeable now, each step weighed down by effort. John knew that physical pain, just like emotional pain, could be devastating, especially for an animal like Augustus, who had been trained to endure anything without hesitation. But no one, not even a war horse, was invincible. He grabbed a bucket of clean water and a cloth, slowly re-entering the pen. Augustus stopped, his ears flicking back in alert, but he didn't back away like before. "It's okay, boy," John said in a low, soothing tone, kneeling beside the horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." Carefully, he wiped the cloth across Augustus's hind leg, looking for signs of injury. When he touched a more sensitive spot, Augustus made loudly and stepped to the side, nearly hitting John with his hoof. I know, John murmured, pulling back just enough to avoid startling him. "It hurts, but we need to fix this." He felt an unsettling familiarity in Augustus's reaction. During the years of war, there had been moments when John had also recoiled from the touch of a doctor or a friend, the trauma making even care feel unbearable. Now he saw the same reflection in Augustus. While working carefully, John began to speak, not exactly to Augustus, but to himself, to the emptiness around him. "I should have come back for you," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have fought harder to get you out of that place. But I was broken, kid. I was just trying to survive." He stopped swallowing hard as painful memories filled his mind. "They said you had disappeared, that they couldn't find you in the chaos. I believed them because it was easier than admitting that maybe I could have done more." Augustus lowered his head slightly, his eyes shining as if something in John's words made sense. The man stood up, taking a deep breath. "But I'm here now," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "and we're going to fix this. You've saved me so many times, Augustus. Now it's my turn to save you." After a few minutes, John was able to examine Augustus's hoof more closely. There was a slight swelling, maybe from an old injury that had never been properly treated. He knew it would take time and patience, but it wasn't impossible to heal. When he finished, he gently stroked the horse's neck. Augustus didn't pull away this time. It was a small step, but to John it meant everything. The sunset painted the sky with warm colors as John watched Augustus from outside the enclosure. The horse was calmer, its movements less hesitant, but there was still an emotional distance that seemed insurmountable. John felt the weight of this barrier and knew it wouldn't be easy to overcome. He slipped one hand into his pocket, feeling the small metal bell he had found among his old belongings. That object had been a symbol of survival for both of them during tough times, and he hoped it could now become a symbol of reconnection. Kimmy, who was nearby gathering hay, noticed John's thoughtful expression and approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked, offering a shy smile. He nodded slowly but didn't look away from Augustus. "It's strange," he replied, being so close to him and yet feeling like we're miles apart. Kimmy placed her hand on John's shoulder, offering a silent gesture of support. "Why does he mean so much to you?" she asked, curious yet cautious. John took a deep breath before answering. "Because he saved my life, not once but several times, and I promised I would never leave him behind." His voice carried a weight that Kimmy hadn't expected. She realized that the bond between them was deeper than anyone could imagine. While they were talking, Augustus approached the fence, watching John with cautious curiosity. It was a small but meaningful movement. Kimmy smiled as she noticed. "I think he's starting to trust again," she said, trying to inject a bit of optimism into the conversation. John nodded, but his eyes revealed that he knew the road ahead would still be long. The next morning at dawn, John walked to the enclosure with the bell in his hand. He gently shook it, producing a metallic sound that echoed through the air. Augustus lifted his head, his ears picking up the familiar sound. Slowly, he took a few steps toward John, his eyes shining with a mix of recognition and caution. It was a brief moment, but it rekindled John's hope. "You remember this, don't you, boy?" John murmured, trying to hold back the emotion in his voice. He knew that simple gesture meant more than it seemed. The sound of the bell was a reminder of the days when the trust between them was unshakable. Now it was a promise that they could rebuild that together. The silence in the old training ground was absolute, except for the soft sound of the wind moving through the leaves. John remained still as Augustus explored the area, each step of the horse echoing like a distant reminder of the past. The yard where they had trained was unrecognizable, overtaken by vegetation and time. But there was something in the air await, a collective memory that seemed to pulse between them. For Augustus, the place stirred something long dormant. For John, it was the chance to finally face what he had been avoiding. John opened the pocket of his jacket and took out the small metal bell. He shook the object, its sound reverberating through the air like a familiar melody filled with history. Augustus froze, his ears perking up immediately. His eyes locked onto the bell, and he took a small step forward, hesitant. "You remember this, don't you, boy?" John whispered, feeling his throat tighten. The bell was a symbol of the moments when they had trusted each other to survive. Now it was a reminder that they could still heal together. The horse moved closer, almost touching John with his nose. It was a small gesture, but one full of meaning. John let the bell fall to the ground, its sound muffled against the earth. "I left you behind, Augustus," he confessed, his voice low and trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that you'd be safe without me. But the truth is, I was scared of facing everything we lost." He took a deep breath, feeling the words come out with difficulty. "But I'm here now, and we can move forward together." Augustus lifted his head, his gaze meeting John's. It was as if, in that moment, something broke, a hidden barrier that had kept them apart. The horse gave a soft whinny, a sound John recognized as acceptance. He reached out and touched Augustus's forehead, feeling the connection he thought he had lost forever. A deep sense of relief washed over him, and for the first time in years, John felt there was a path ahead. Kimmy arrived shortly after, watching the scene from a distance. She said nothing, just stood there with a calm smile on her face. She knew something deep had changed, something that didn't need explanation. John and Augustus had found each other again, and in doing so, had also found the hope they had lost. As the sun began to set, John and Augustus walked together across the field, just as they had in the old days. It wasn't just a walk, it was a symbol of a new beginning. The past couldn't be erased, but they had decided they would no longer be prisoners of it. And in that shared silence, they both found something more valuable than memory, the strength to move forward. The story of the soldier and the warhorse is not just a journey to rediscover the past, but a journey to confront the invisible scars both carry. They fought side by side, survived the most brutal battles, but time and pain created a deep rift, a distance hard to bridge. However, it is through patience, understanding, and the bond of true friendship that these wounds begin to heal. That's the message this story shares. No matter how tough life gets, no matter how irreparable things may seem, we can always reconnect if we are willing to cherish and be patient. Thank you for following this deeply emotional story. If you believe in the power of such stories to stir your emotions, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future videos. We'll continue to bring you touching and meaningful stories about friendship, courage, and the power of forgiveness. Join us as we explore more wonderful stories because we truly believe that each story has the potential to change our lives. Don't miss out. Subscribe today